Hey guys, so we're going to talk about the 6 principles of government. We're going to try our best to tie it into the last unit we talked about, which was political ideology and how political parties take on different ideologies and really how they shift to the will of the people, popular culture, and kind of a constant shifting landscape in American politics. So we're going to look at the 6 principles of government. Remember, these are not the purpose statements that are put in the preamble. This is kind of the purpose of the structure, right? The principles that surround the structure of American government, not the proposed outcomes, which would be the purpose statements, ensure domestic tranquility, et cetera, et cetera. So let's get started, and I'll try to also, if not answer, bring in some ideas about how you could potentially answer some of the analysis questions that are in with the assignment as well. So we have the first concept is the idea of popular sovereignty. Simply put, popular sovereignty is the idea of popular meaning the people, the populace, sovereignty meaning the ability to rule. Really, if you look at the word, the root word is reign. So like a king reigns. And so the idea of popular sovereignty is a country is ruled by the people and that the people get to decide the direction of the government, right? I like this picture that does a good job showing that is the majority of the people decide the government should go in this direction. If you were to look at this picture, it shows the idea of the basic structure of political parties, right? And we're going to say party identification in voters is the biggest block at the bottom. So think about it this way. If all of a sudden there is a massive shift in ideology and thinking of voters, like we think one thing is right one day and then the next day or the next week or sometime later they start to shift their opinions about a particular issue, then parties move with it, right? This is the kind of like the base of the pyramid, and the political party kind of the structure goes all the way up. And it has to shift with the opinion of the people. Some good examples of that, or some examples of that, would be the idea of same-sex marriage in the United States. 30 years ago, certainly conservative parties would be universally opposed to it. Even Democrat, more liberal parties would not necessarily want to deal with an issue like that because it was so divisive. Now that is because it is more acceptable mainstream, political people, voters are more likely to accept that. And so the political parties are more likely to embrace it. The conservative Republican parties might not universally accept something like this, but it is certainly not one of their major platforms like it was 15, 20 years ago. Now, popular sovereignty is also, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? If you're going to talk about that the government needs to follow the direction of the will of the people, you're going to look back at the days of the Civil War and the lead up to the antebellum period, the lead up to the Civil War. And that was a major concept that drove when new states and new territories were being admitted into the United States, the concept of popular sovereignty played a major role into whether or not those states were going to allow slavery. So we look back at that now and say, well, no, of course, there should be no slavery. However, the idea of popular sovereignty is if more than 50% of the population of a region believed it, then it should be the law of the land. So now we're going to look at how popular sovereignty really plays a role in the other 5 principles. And eventually you're going to realize that certain things win over other things. So popular sovereignty is not necessarily above the law, is what we're going to look at as we kind of build into this. So something like slavery, which is obviously against the law now, you can't have a majority of a population will something that is against the law. Okay, so Limited government is the next principle. Now, this is one of the things I want you to consider. How are civil rights and liberties, freedom of speech, religion, an extension of the principle of limited government? And so one idea is that limited government is meant to protect individual rights, freedoms of individual people. Now, if you're going to look at what that might mean is, there's a constitutional guarantee of the freedom of religion in the United States. Now, that means the government is limited as to how they can approach taking away somebody's religious freedom or freedom of speech or other constitutional guarantees of civil rights. So that is applied to the individual. However, it is also applied to states. So if states decide to pass laws that are kind of borderline, and maybe laws that limit or restrict certain voting rights, but do it in a way that is not unconstitutional. The idea of limited government means the federal government, the central government, can't stop state governments from acting on behalf of their population. If their population likes an idea, the states have the ability to enforce that idea as long as that idea is constitutional. Now, again, this talks about limited government and popular sovereignty. These are the states on the lead up to the Civil War, or actually during the Civil War, that legalized slavery in red, did not in blue. Actually, that's not true. These are Union versus Confederate states. It's a more accurate way to look at that map. But the idea of limited government and popular sovereignty is certainly something that Southern states held on to as a primary cause for the Civil War. It wasn't just slavery, although when you look back at it, what they were trying to protect was slavery. So that's sticky. All right. Next one, separation of powers. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about this. So every country has three basic branches of government. You have the legislature, right? We also call that Congress in the United States. Their job is to make laws, right? It is not anybody else's job to make laws. So separation of powers means each branch of government has a specific set of powers that they can do. The executive branch is to sign laws. I would also say enforce laws. Executive means to execute laws. So that is their primary function, is to execute the laws that the legislature has passed. The judicial branch is to interpret laws around the country and whether or not interpret individuals and their potential violation of those laws. So that is, there are obviously other powers that each branch of government has, but those are the primary functions as it really, if you're going to look at laws and kind of laws is the rule book of the country. Each of the three branches has a specific job as it applies to that idea. Okay. Now we're going to look at the idea of checks and balances. Checks and balances are similar to separation of powers, but if you were just to look, if there are plenty of countries that just separate powers, but don't really have any checks or balances over each other. So you might separate the powers out and say the executive branch pretty much has everything. The legislature has a few branches, but there are no checks over the executive's power, meaning there are no ways for the other branches to limit the power of the executive. It's kind of like the idea of limited government, but this one is limited by itself, okay? Checks and balances means although it is the legislative branch's job to make laws, the executive branch can veto a proposed law, right? So that is a check that the executive has over the legislative. Now, what they can also do is they can override a presidential veto if 2/3 or 66% of Congress agrees to override it. So they don't have ultimate power, right? But there is a balance. That's the idea, that these checks balance each other out, okay? So There are some other pieces, like the executive branch, that they actually choose judges in the judicial, and those judges are approved by the legislative branch, et cetera, et cetera. Let's look at, you can look at these, and we'll talk about checks and balances a little bit more. But one significant power that the legislature has over the executive is they can impeach the executive. So that means if Congress believes that the president or somebody in the executive branch has committed high crimes or misdemeanors, so basically that's crimes against the country, right, that are worth that person being charged with a crime and removed from office, it is their ability to do that. Now, what I wanted you to look at for this question is, how can partisanship in government obstruct the concept of checks and balances? So what we're looking at is the idea of partisanship. Remember we talked about last time is the political parties that occupy the different branches of government, except for the judicial, hopefully. Those branches, those parties have a bit of self-interest in the way that things play out. So, for instance, if we're going to look at ex-President Trump, he was impeached twice. Now, you could look at the role of partisanship. Partisanship played a role one way or another, and we don't, I mean, from which direction, it might be up to interpretation. But if you were a Democrat, you could say the role that partisanship played in the impeachment of Trump was that he was acquitted without a fair trial, and that the Republicans did not actually look at evidence and actually rushed to judgment to acquit Trump before they actually considered evidence. If you're a Republican, you might say that actually he was put on trial for partisan reasons, that all of the evidence was either blown out of proportion or what misrepresented what actually happened, and that he was put on trial because it was a Democrat Party trying to attack the Republican Party. Either way, partisanship definitely obstructed the idea of checks and balances. Either he shouldn't have been charged or he shouldn't have been acquitted. Especially when you look at the votes along party lines, is pretty much universally, except for in the second Trump impeachment trial, there were quite a few, well, not quite a few, but there were more than in the first, Republicans that supported impeachment. But other than that, those few outliers, parties voted with each other to support or oppose the president who was a Republican. So that is the idea of how partisanship plays a role, and that is increasingly becoming true in American politics. Hopefully, I mean, that certainly is not the intent of the idea of checks and balances, that partisanship could even play a role. I don't know, we'll see what happens with that in the future. So the idea of judicial review is the idea that let's look at the Constitution like it's the rule book, right? And Congress is trying to follow the rules when they create laws, and the executive branch is trying to follow the rules when they enforce laws. However, the rules sometimes get a little bit dicey, and sometimes the rules get a little bit vague, too general, right? And so one of the rules says we have free speech, okay? And free speech can be interpreted lots of different ways. The state of Texas passed a law in the 80s that said you can't burn a flag. It is desecration of national pride, or I forget the exact language of the law. And the person who did that sued the government and said, actually, that law violates my freedom of speech. And so it was up to the judicial branch to interpret the rule book, interpret the Constitution, and say, does this law violate the Constitution? They actually ruled it did, and so now that is protected as free speech. But the bigger picture is judicial review is meant to protect civil rights and liberties. It is meant to protect the government from overreaching its limits. It's also meant to protect states from overreaching their limit, or the federal government from overreaching onto states. It is meant to the judges interpret the Constitution as it applies to different laws that are written by Congress. So you can look at separation of powers, or even how branches of government interact with each other to checks and balances. So it could intervene in a situation where there's a dispute between the executive and the judicial and the legislative branch, and there's a constitutional question about that certainly could be an issue of judicial review. The next piece is the idea of federalism. Okay, federalism. Let's look at these maps from left to right. Let's imagine that the United States of America is not the United States of America. It is just United America, and there are no states. If that were the case, there would be no federalism. And that means that you would have a central government that would make Washington, D.C. is right around here, I think. Maybe a little lower. Yeah, right there. So the federal government that makes laws that affect everyone. There are no local decisions. Okay, that's the idea of federalism, that decisions are can trickle down to be local, that the government, the central government, can make certain powers that are constitutional, but a lot of things are left up to states, and then states leave things up to regional governments to decide. So you might have different, even within Oregon, you might have different codes or laws that that have like seatbelt laws that might be, maybe that's a bad example, but there might be different codes or punishments had they deal to certain issues from region to region within Oregon, and then certainly from state to state within the United States. Okay, so let's look at certain things, and I think the idea of something like marijuana, right? There are different levels of legality around the United States, and that is the concept of federalism, that it can be legal in Oregon and illegal in Idaho right next door, because that decision has been left up to state governments and local governments, actually just state governments. There are like different helmet laws, right? So you might look at different states, all riders have to wear a helmet, limited helmet laws. There are certain states, this is Illinois and Iowa. Yeah, Iowa. They say, you don't have to wear a helmet. So this is a state decision. There is no federal helmet law. Now, for there to be a federal helmet law, there would have to be a constitutional amendment that actually passes a law. I don't know if that's true. We'll just say that it would have to be a federal law, and then that could bring in different states that would disagree with that, and then they would use the idea of Supreme Court and judicial review to overturn potentially overreaching federal laws. Okay, so I want you to realize from this that all of these concepts are related to each other, and that when like for instance, federalism. Look at the idea of federalism. How does that incorporate the concept of judicial review? How does it incorporate checks and balances? How does it incorporate separation of powers? How does it incorporate limited government, et cetera, et cetera? You could really draw a web between all 6 of these and draw lines between them about how they incorporate each other. Okay, so we'll discuss that in class, and hope everybody's well. See you soon. Okay, bye.